Okay, time is up, so let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the morning session of our Academic Network Conference. So this is the fourth session in this year's PRI in-person conference. And so in case you are not familiar with the Academic Network, we have over 30,000 members among practitioners and also academics in the world who are connected with PRI through all kinds of events and activities that hope to facilitate knowledge exchange between academia and practice. So today in this session, we have three very, very interesting and very dynamic papers from probably the most international panel for the entire Academic Network Conference. So our first presenter is Elvira from University of New South Wales, Sydney in Australia. So she's the Associate Professor of Finance and will present a paper on disclosing environmental innovation information. Our second presenter is Nathan from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So he's the director of Erasmus platform for sustainable value creation, and he will present us something from the legal perspective, even though it's focusing on disclosure. And lastly, we have Samuel from a Chicago booth. So Samuel is actually still a PhD student, so he's one of the very few PhD candidates who are in the program, so definitely a start. So he will present us a very interesting paper from the African oil sector. Okay, then we will have our first discussant, academic discussant, Janet from Georgetown University, who is an associate professor of finance, will present the academic discussion on all the three papers. And last but not least, Monica Beth from, who is an investor practice who is the director of investor practice at Asia Investor Group on climate change. So she will present us the discussion from the practice perspective. So my name is Yusha, which means rain and summer. I'm an assistant professor of accounting at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and also a research fellow at PRI. So now I would like to give the floor to our first presenter, Elvira, to get us started.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to join this panel and present our work, and hopefully we get a lot of feedback from people that are out there and doing this kind of work. And thank you. I don't need to justify to this crowd that we are in a crisis, a climate crisis, and we cannot hedge our planet away. So we have to do something, and we have to think about what solutions we can bring to the table to be able to move along and save what we have for future generations. That's what we're going to do in this paper, which is think about potential interventions that can help us in getting to a much more sustainable future and growth. This paper is joint work with all colleagues from all across Sydney, and the title is slightly different, the pitch is going to be slightly different from what's written, but the underlying message is still the same. So, there are two approaches that have emerged in academic literature to how do we address this crisis. The first one is scaling back. Okay? It doesn't take a genius to figure out that if we consume less, we will pollute less, right? However, that has a lot of other unintended consequences and externalities on employment, social inequality, and so on. The second approach, which has been very forcefully pushed forward by Guion and a lot of other economists, is innovation-driven growth. So basically, the key point here is that there is no sustainable growth without innovation. And something that is important to keep in mind here is that environmental technology and knowledge related to environmental technology has a significant public good characteristic. So it's non-rivalry, it's non-excludable, compared to some private good knowledge, things like inventing the next iPhone, right? So knowledge in general and information is kind of a special form of economic commodity. It's R&D is a special kind of production of information. And if we think of R&D and innovation, basically these projects are very uncertain. The production cost is very high. However, other people's replication of these costs, of these projects, is actually quite low or almost zero. So R&D creates a lot of significant positive externalities for everyone in the economy through knowledge spillovers. We can have a bit of a snowball effect. Now, what the problem here is, though, is the fact that there is a discrepancy between the social returns and the private benefits, to a certain extent, to revealing this information. And this problem is even larger in the environmental R&D space because, as I was discussing earlier with Monica, we have a bit of a double public good or double common good scenario, which is, first, of course, information is a public good and it's a common good, and when we share it, we can create spillovers. But then information or knowledge or innovation in the clean space is also helping to address an externality, which is another public good. So we have a double public good scenario. And that's why we've seen a lot of governments now putting in money into trying to spur innovation in the green space. So in the US, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law, $100 billion. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, another $400 billion directed towards clean energy and green-related innovation. The issue here, though, from the public perspective is disclosure versus trade secrets. Companies do not like to disclose a lot of the inventions that they make. They prefer to keep them secrets because they get higher returns from these inventions. While to get and to harness the positive knowledge spillovers and the externality snowball effects, we really need this information to be out there. We need this innovation to be made public with the appropriate intellectual property protections. So there is an important policy implication here, which is we are assuming that R&D implies knowledge spillover. We are subsidizing companies to do R&D in the hope that we will see knowledge spillover. But if this R&D is not made public, if it's not patented and innovation is not in the public space, this spillover cannot really occur. So there has been little emphasis on knowledge disclosures, and that's what we are going to do in this paper. So we derive the private and social valuation effects of knowledge sharing. We use EPA actions and sanctions as a plausibly exogenous shock to knowledge spillover via patenting. We show that firms' environmental disclosure via clean patent filings and the latency to publish patent applications actually goes up when there is this EPA actions. And then we show the real effects of this knowledge spillover. Now, we focus on pollution abatement technology and the EPA enforcement actions as a shock to patenting and to manage the benefits and costs. So, why patenting? Well, patenting, as some of you may be aware, basically is the full public disclosure of the invention in exchange for the protection and the exclusive rights guaranteed to the assignee. However, everybody else can see this patent and build on this patent with the appropriate citations. Okay? Now, the important part about patents is also that they are third-party verified. We had a whole session yesterday on greenwashing, right? Where firms can go out there and claim whatever they wish to claim. However, they cannot really, they don't back up, as Buchwei's paper was showing, they do not back up these words with actions. So patenting and disclosing clean innovation is actually showing that firms are putting into action what they are talking about. So with stock prices, financial information, and information on innovation and patenting, we can estimate the social economic returns and the private costs and benefits to knowledge spillover. I'm going to illustrate what we're doing with an example. So I'm going to talk about Cabot Corporation, which is a global leader in carbon black, and it basically a very important material that we use from, tar in building our roads to tires and inks. Cabot, basically, like most carbon black producers, has faced scrutiny on its environmental impact, particularly their air pollution. At the end of 2010, Cabot faced an enforcement action by the EPA, and it was also brought to court by DOJ for violations of the Clean Air Act. they basically do not have enough control of their NOx emissions. So what's the cost? Well, basically Cabot could be forced to close all of its facilities and their permits to produce could be withdrawn. That's the maximum penalty. So possibly they could end up ceasing production. So what did Cabot do? Well, first, Cabot in November 2011, so basically less than a year after the EPA went after them, filed a clean patent on cutting-edge technology on reducing NOx. In July 2012, they filed another clean patent on new technology to address oil spills. Now, they had not filed any clean patents all the way since 2004. Both patents are considered state-of-the-art in the technology environment, pollution abatement technology. So in November 2013, actually, they finally settled with the EPA, and they had to pay about $1 million in penalties, as well as another $85 million to install state-of-the-art pollution control, basically applying the technology that they patented. Now, to do this, though, as you can see here, Cabot really had to use a lot of work that was created by other firms. So without the technology developed by TISO and developed by Zinco and so on, they wouldn't have been able to develop the technology that they had. So they relied on other people's clean technology to be able to have what they patented. So Cabot's example kind of tells us that there is, first, firms respond to the EPA action, and they patent. They may have had these patents in the drawer, they may have developed them in the short term, but the important thing is that they disclose this information. This information is then used by other companies to build further technology. So what we find using this shock to the EPA, to companies through the EPA, is that the social returns, so externalities from technology spillovers, go well beyond the firm's boundaries. Actually, the technology spillovers are highly correlated with reduced toxic emissions of the firms that are citing the technology that is patented as a result of the EPA action. Okay. The private costs basically are also there, but they are much smaller. Social benefits are 10 times larger than the private costs. So what we learned from this exercise is that policies that promote corporate disclosure of environmental technology can have far-reaching positive effects on achieving sustainable growth. At the firm level, the firm also gets private benefits because the firm is to a certain extent signaling information either to the EPA to basically be able to negotiate a settlement, or to the stockholders and other market participants about the fact that they can address this environmental risk or the increase in the environmental risk due to the EPA actions. So we can show that more clean patents are filed and there is earlier voluntary disclosure of these patents. They are signaling to regulators and to investors. So I'm going to show 3 tables. I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to be very quick. First, we basically adapted the work of Blue Metal in Econometrica to be able to, I'm sorry, there is no pointer here, to basically show that the spill tech, which is the clean technology spillover to other market participants, is highly positive, and whatever is coming from competitors, which is spill tech C of this clean technology, is negative, but it's very small. And if we compare these coefficients, the spill tech S is about 10 times larger than spill tech C. Now, we can also think about whether there is under-disclosure, right? Because in the end, if everybody's already disclosing everything they have, then there should be no reaction when the EPA is exercising an action against the company. And more importantly, there should be, within the company, there should be no difference between clean and non-clean patents if the EPA is coming after you and you've already disclosed everything. And this is not what we find. So what we find here is that firms file a lot more clean patents after the formal action by the EPA, and they absolutely do nothing in other invention areas. Okay. And finally, what are the externalities? Are there social returns? So to do this, we basically look at the toxic emissions of the firms that are citing the clean patents. Okay. So here the EPA shock is highly exogenous to the citations because in the end, whoever is using this technology has no relation with the EPA action. The action is only at the focal firm level. And we call this clean acquired knowledge, which is the citations that the patents that have been awarded, granted after the EPA action get. And you can see that the firms that are citing, so the firms that acquire this clean knowledge, basically have lower emissions across the board all the way to 5 years ahead. While those that are citing the rest of the knowledge, so the rest of the patents, if anything, they have positive effect on emissions. And that makes a lot of sense because you're just growing, right? They have new innovations, they have new products, they're expanding their market, and therefore they emit more because they're producing more. So this paper tries to, where is this? Okay. So this paper basically shows that technology spillovers lead to social returns by reducing emissions way beyond the firm's boundaries, but also create some product market rivalry costs. The social returns of the environmental technology disclosure outweigh the private cost. This suggests that there is a systemic under-disclosure of clean innovation. Now, in terms of policies, we should reduce barriers of reporting and disclosing clean innovation, which may generate much larger social benefits. Maybe make it mandatory if you are relying on government money to create this knowledge and this innovation. Again, this is not giving it away for free. This is still a patented and protected space by IP law. However, this allows other people to build on the technology. We think we contribute to 2 literatures on industrial pollution and climate finance, as well as the disclosure accounting literature. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the comments.
So thank you very much, Elvira. So we were discussing our colleagues yesterday that this is one of the first papers that documents the positive externalities of decarbonization. So it's a very important paper. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to enter your questions or comments using the Q&A function in the app. So we have an iPad here to look at your questions. Also, you can save the questions at the end. So when we open up the floor, you can ask your questions as well. Yeah. So thank you very much. Now let's have our second presenter, Nathan, from the Netherlands, to present us a legal paper.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. So, as been said, I'm a lawyer, which probably makes me the public enemy of most of the audience. But I'm here to talk to you about a very important subject, which is net zero commitments. Sorry, I have a sore throat. Just a few words about this paper. I'm a director of Erasmus Platform for Sustainable Value Creation, which is a sort of research center on sustainable finance, partnering with financial institutions and corporates. But this is a sequel of my work that I did at Yale University when I was there a postdoc and lecturer. So today I will present you this new paper entitled The Net Zero Ledger. I will walk you through the paper as I analyze, criticize, and make recommendations on the rising regulation of corporate net zero commitments. What this paper is about in a nutshell is the huge loophole regulators from the ISSB to the EU, the SEC, and the TPT have left wide open in regulating sustainable disclosure. But first things first, right, yes. For those of you who attended Mark Carney's speech yesterday, you should perhaps remember the spectacular rise of countries, companies, and financial commitments to the transition to net zero greenhouse emissions. And they are evidently necessary for mitigating climate change and accelerating the transition to a sustainable economy. What we see, furthermore, is that corporate net zero commitments have continued to rise over the past year, even despite the ESG backlash in the United States and several big players walking back their net zero commitments. What emerged from that is the rise of true business standards for corporations around net zero. And that is despite the absence of any legal obligations for this corporation to meet this kind of commitment, and a fortiori to transition to net zero. But even as net zero became a business standard, the standard has been the object first of self-regulation. You know that, you probably have been part of that or seen that, SBTi, AIGCC, companies part of a climate pledge. They all came up with criteria to distinguish genuine net zero commitments from the more aesthetic ones, let's say. And net zero has been, as a result, a rising point of contention where lacking detail is increasingly suspicious, not only from the investor perspective, but also from the general public as a whole. And self-regulation can only go that far. And with rising demands of transparency, it's not surprising that regulators have entered the fray as part of their efforts to shed more light on firms' exposure to climate change. And you probably heard in this conference and many of it that there's a growing gap among regulators. On the one hand, the EU's double materiality approach, almost the Armageddon if we could hear some people here. The SEC's very limited approach and pared down risk, and the ISSB's middle road option. But in fact, when it comes to the regulation of corporate net zero targets, what we see is a remarkable alignment between the different standards among the different approaches. And where there's arguably a divergence is on transition plans. No surprise here, with a perceivable movement towards requiring net zero transition plans from the largest companies, but also more expansive disclosure requirements. The transition stage, so to say, of net zero regulation differs from disclosure regulation to the extent that transition plans are more forward-looking and they're more financial-oriented. Well, there are clear limits to this approach. This is an old graph from Carbon Tracker in 2021. But it's remarkable that if you compare that to more recent reports, change has been minimal. Maybe it's not surprising because regulation has not really come into force yet. But nearly a decade after the Paris Agreement, 7 years after the TCFD, what we see is generally consistent, and that is very little reflection of climate risks and climate matters in financial reports of companies. And it's more likely that this won't significantly change with upcoming regulation. That is because a lot of new disclosure requirements, notably but not exclusively when it comes to net zero targets, consist of qualitative, narrative type, or backward-looking disclosure. And that won't help because this type of information is often not comparable for investors, it won't be consistent and reliable because companies will have significant discretion in reporting, and it won't be meaningful because most of it will be backward-looking. The typical example is, of course, GHG emissions. I'm not saying here it's not useful. What I'm telling you is that, and as you probably know, it will only tell you as much on past efforts. It will not tell you anything about upcoming efforts. It will tell you that perhaps that company took the low-hanging fruit of decarbonization, but it won't tell you more than that. Even the most famous transition plans, again, they are useful, but they represent non-binding promises. And the CSDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive of the EU, leaves much discretion to companies that are concerned. What happens if a company fails to act on net zero commitments? You can have all the CSRD, the TPT, the CSDD you want, you won't be able to do much. What's worse is that there is a major loophole hidden in all of this. Because of a new regulation focused on non-financial disclosures, they failed to require alignment between non-financial disclosures and financial disclosures. We're 10 years after the TCFD, and regulators forgot the basics is the need for accurate financial disclosure and provide a clear picture of the company's exposure to climate risk and action in this respect. The result of that is that companies can trumpet their net zero commitments in their sustainability reporting or narrative section of their annual report, all while saying and doing something different in their financial statements. Studies from the Carbon Tracker and others have talked about this inconsistency. It's even clearer when you look at the details, when you look at some of the annual reports. Take this US utility company that has since 2019 a net zero commitment, a commitment to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In 2022, it extended this commitment to include Scope 2 and 3 emissions. The same company estimated in a financial report that the average remaining useful life of its natural gas assets is 57 years from 2023, i.e. 30 years past its target date for net zero. This company also shows in its cash flow statement increases in gas-related investment much faster than electricity-related investments. And that's already a lot of transparency because it's a regulated utility in the energy sector. It's much harder to read in the tea leaves of others because they don't provide much, if any, information on climate in their financial. A top company in chemicals will only say that it invests $5 to $8 million a year out of 600 million in capital expenditure. Others like Alphabet, that is Google, or General Motors that speak at length in their annual reports about the critical strategic role of their net zero commitments would not provide in their 10Ks any financial information backing up their claims. So what do? To address this problem, we need to change tack in regulation. We need to refocus the regulatory scrutiny of the financial disclosures and require alignment between financial and non-financial disclosure. This means that when a company has net zero commitment, it must clearly detail how this is reflected in its financial. I'm going to give you a few examples in a minute. But why do we need this in the first place? Not only because of a loophole I told you about, but also because financial disclosure provides much more reliable, comparable information, especially from the investor perspective, about what a company is doing and what it plans to do. It may be surprising for some of you because you're like, okay, annual report, it's about the past year, so what it's going to tell me about the future. It's full of important details: revenues, capital expenditures, asset impairments, goodwill, useful life of assets, estimated assumptions. All of this tells you a lot about what the company is doing and plans to do. So what we need to do in a nutshell is go back to basics, to the original ambition of the TCFD and the current ambition of the ISSB. And if you're looking, it may take you quite some time to find in the ISSB or CSRD much on this kind of financial disclosures. By contrast, the SEC's climate disclosure, so from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, even though it has been widely criticized, made very interesting proposals to ensure the alignment of financial disclosure with climate matters and especially with net zero commitments. So how do we do that? There are plenty of options out there to ensure that financial disclosure are consistent with net zero commitments and transition plans. If you're not a fan of government interference like the United States or probably Canada, you might do what the SEC is doing, just provide some detailed information at this disaggregated level about how your commitment to net zero affect your estimated assumptions, your asset valuation, your impairment, your liabilities, etc. One could go further by asking for reporting against a shadow carbon price, for instance, or even by rethinking more broadly how financial reporting and financial accounting is undertaken based on models that you may have heard about: the integrated value model that we have at Rotterdam School of Management, the impact-weighted accounts at Harvard. And it's not as radical as you may think. Besides the AIGCC rules, regulators in the United States, the EU, the UK have increasingly emphasized their focus on consistency in financial reporting. Both FASB in the United States and IFRS in the rest of the world have issued educational papers on climate-related matters and how this should be reflected in financial accounting. And the ISB, so the International Accounting Standards Board, has recently communicated on its intention to consider standards on net zero impairment. Furthermore, we have green taxonomy. It may be helpful on the plus side of the equation with net zero investments activities. What I'll do is, all right, I'm actually too early in my slides, but anyway, I'll conclude by referring to a claim of Emmanuel Faber, which is the chairman of the ISSB, who said that ISSB standards create the new accounting language of the 21st century. Instead, the ISSB, like most regulators out there, has fallen short of providing consistent, comparable, and reliable disclosure that is useful to investors. They have further left open a loophole between non-financial disclosures and financial disclosure that, in the case of net zero commitments, can greatly undermine transparency and trust. And what we need is a renewed focus on financial disclosure to ensure alignment, consistency, and transparency, so that we can finally move forward within the economy of the 21st century. Thank you.
Very much, Nathan. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A function in our app, and so using Slido, so we can check it later. And personally, as an accounting scholar, I will very much thank Nathan for helping us to pointing out the loophole in the accounting standards and also helping us to fix it. So thank you very much. Now let's welcome our last but not least presenter, Samuel, to present us a paper about the oil sector in Africa. Samuel.
Okay, first off, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for including the paper in the session, as well as Monica and Janet in advance for agreeing to discuss the paper. And thank you all for being here. So the paper that I'll be presenting today is co-authored work with Hans Christensen and Andrew McKinley, both at Chicago Booth. It's titled Filling the Governance Gap, Corporate Commitments and Environmental Externalities in the African Oil Sector. So to motivate a bit, we're all abundantly familiar, as Elvira mentioned as well, of the scientific consensus on the need to reduce global carbon emissions. But government action has been seen by some corporate stakeholders as insufficient to address this increasingly dire issue. Stakeholders have then turned to privately pressuring corporations to reduce their environmental impact. And corporations often respond to such private pressure with standardized long-term environmental commitments. Now, Nathan talked about a broader commitment, the net zero, and the PRI also gives principles for responsible investment, right? But also more specific commitments like the Science-Based Targets Initiative exist in the space as well. And these commitments serve as coordination devices that may facilitate the private monitoring of corporations by individual or corporate investors. And so these coordination devices, what I mean by that is that they impose a sort of coordinated standard that, by which investors can compare corporations as well as see whether, they're making progress toward the goal that's specified. So the question we ask in the paper today is, can commitments fill this gap in public governance? And so to understand this question and to answer it, we need to know how corporations fulfill commitments. So generally, corporations can fulfill commitments in two different ways. The first being making operational improvements, right? This is what we as stakeholders are after when pressuring corporations, right? We want them to make real operational changes while continuously operating their assets efficiently, right? And this behavior benefits the environment, right? Second, though, corporations can fulfill commitments by simply divesting the assets they don't want to own, right, that look maybe bad on their books, right? They can, divest perhaps also to managers who are less competent and have fewer sustainability incentives, right? And you can imagine this is a common occurrence because assets are, at least dirty assets, are worth less to companies that are held to a higher environmental standard, creating sort of a scope for trade that allows for the flow of these assets to companies that are held to lower environmental standards. And I want to draw a distinction between this and the divestiture of financial assets by asset managers, right? This is those companies actually divesting real operated assets in an attempt to sort of clear these off their books, right? Now, the net environmental impact between these two forces is interesting, since only the former contributes to filling the public governance gap, whereas the latter does not. So the setting we use to explore this idea is the World Bank's zero routine flaring commitment. It's a natural gas flaring, as mentioned yesterday by Yasser, is one of the most problematic practices in the oil industry. It causes local health concerns by releasing PM 2.5 into the atmosphere and global climate concerns by releasing large amounts of greenhouse gases, specifically CO2. And so this issue prompted the launching of the ZRF initiative by the World Bank in 2015. And signatories today account for about 60% of global flaring activity. And this commitment, in contrast with some of the broader commitments that have been implemented, is a very targeted commitment, right? First, it's specific to routine gas flaring. In fact, it doesn't even apply to emergency flaring, which is still allowed for safety reasons. Second, it stipulates an explicit goal, which is that companies should reach zero by the year 2030. And it's monitorable by stakeholders. Using similar data to what we use in this study, satellite imaging, stakeholders, at least those with the proper technology, can monitor corporations' flaring activity across the globe. And the African setting is a suitable setting to observe this, right? We might wonder, well, if they can monitor, if stakeholders can monitor across the globe, why are we focusing on Africa specifically? Well, for a few reasons. First, in the African oil sector, there's weak government oversight on average, which allows corporate governance or stakeholder pressure to play a larger role in constraining corporate behavior. Second, there's greater between-country variation in the strength of institutions than in most other regions, right? So then we can sort of observe whether the effect is more salient in those regions with poor public governance. And third, it's very timely, as the environmental consequences of corporate actions are increasingly realized in developing nations, especially in the oil and gas as well as the mining extractive sectors. So I'm going to talk briefly about this. It was mentioned yesterday. We use similar data to what Yasser used in his study. We measure flaring with reasonable accuracy based on satellite imaging. So to identify flares, essentially we look at fires above a temperature threshold of 1400 kelvins, and scientifically this allows us to identify pretty much beyond reasonable doubt that these fires are actually natural gas flares, as most other fires cannot reach this temperature. And giving us sort of confidence that of the geographic accuracy of the flaring data and of the data that locates these oil assets. About 86% of African flares occur within blocks in our sample, and more than 90% of those flares occur in blocks labeled as actively operating. So let's get to a few results here. The first thing we look at is that first hypothesis, whether gas flaring changes for the blocks that companies continuously operate, the ones that are not sold off. So we perform a dynamic difference in difference regression here, and we can see that around the commitment year, before at least the 3 years before, we observe relatively flat trends in flaring, comparing committed and uncommitted firms. But after the commitment, we observe this sharp and significant decrease in flaring for committed relative to uncommitted firms. And magnitude-wise, this levels out at around a 43% reduction between 2 and 4 years after the commitment. So this equates to about 137 flare nights per year. If you're interested in the paper, we do have sort of detailed computations to give you a sense of how large this is. Doing several sensitivity tests, we observed that the magnitude of our effect size is not sensitive to various specifications that we change in our empiricals. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to directly observe sort of whether public governance of the host country plays a role in how strong this decrease in flaring actually is. So what we do is we separately estimate the same effect for blocks in countries with more and less effective host governments first. So we'll see here that the effect is indeed, as we expect, more salient for blocks located in countries with more ineffective host governments. This is measured by the World Bank's governance indicator by country. Now, the next thing we do is we also look at environmental performance of the host country before the commitment comes into play. And we do observe a much larger decrease for host governments with low environmental performance, though there's somewhat of a trend there, I'll caveat. So that sort of gets to that the sort of filling the governance gap hypothesis is at least reasonable to explain this change in gas flaring for committed firms. So the next thing we look at is this second hypothesis. Does gas flaring change for the blocks that are actually divested from committed firms to uncommitted firms? So first of all, descriptively, we look in our sample to see, well, do we observe divestitures? And yes, of the about 300 blocks that are owned by committed firms, we observe about 27 of them are divested sometime during our sample. And we'll observe also on the right there that the majority of these blocks are divested from committed to uncommitted firms, which is consistent with this scope for trade argument that I made before. And so we will observe, though, that divestitures are relatively uncommon. Only 7% of the blocks owned by committed firms in our sample are divested, and only 5% are sold to uncommitted firms. And so they're relatively uncommon. So the next thing we're going to look at is, well, for those that are divested, do we observe a flaring increase or an environmental deterioration of these assets after the divestiture? So we perform, again, a dynamic DID around the year of divestiture, the year of sale. And again, we observe this increase, again, statistically significant and sharp increase right at the year of divestiture for only those assets that are divested from committed to uncommitted firms. And this is consistent, right, because these are the assets that sort of their owners are, the environmental standards their owners are held to are changing after this divestiture. And for other divestitures, we don't observe much change because these may be for other financial reasons, not sustainability related. And again, we perform several empirical sensitivity tests, and we don't find that our empirical estimates are sensitive to sample selection changes. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the net effect between these two conflicting forces. And so in the paper, you'll find our detailed computations, but the result of those computations is that we find a large reduction in net carbon equivalent emissions after netting the decrease in flaring for continuously operated blocks and the increase in flaring for divested blocks. The main reason is the small number of divested blocks in our sample. And essentially, we are relatively confident in the directional effect, which is that the improvements exceed the deterioration, though the magnitude might depend somewhat on the empirical choices that we made while making these separate estimates. The main takeaway from our paper is that we find both improvements and harmful divestitures, but improvements dominate and fill this public governance gap in the African gas flaring setting. So sort of a point I wanted to connect to from yesterday is Carolyn made a point about how sort of governments can step in and fill the gap from market failures, but here we're sort of consistently saying the opposite as well, right? That in the presence of ineffective public governance, stakeholder pressure and market mechanisms can step in and fill the gap there. And we also find evidence consistent with claims in media articles like The Economist, The New York Times, and The Washington Post of big oil sort of making irresponsible divestitures of its polluting assets. But we find that these divestitures are rare, and they're dominated by operational improvements that committed firms actually make following the commitment. So thank you all again for being here, and I look forward to the discussions ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Samuel, for presenting us this much-needed evidence from the Global South. Now, let's welcome Janet to give us the academic discussion.
Okay, thank you. Do I need to press?
No, you can continue to speak.
Okay. Thank you very much for allowing me to discuss these very interesting papers. So the theme of the session is called Green Commitment, and it's ultimately about whether we can trust the commitment made by private sector firms, and if not, what are the external governance forces that we could.
Sorry, can you hear?
Is there a button that should be?
Should be automatic.
Hello? Hello? Oh, yeah, okay. So I just need to be louder. So the theme of the session is about green commitments, and it's ultimately about whether we can trust commitments made by private sector firms, and whether if not, whether we need external forces to enforce the commitments. So I view this largely as a governance issue. So the traditional corporate governance is about aligning the interests between shareholders and managers, and the goal is to maximize profit generation. Well, with the modern times now, the corporations have multiple objectives, including protecting the environment and reducing their carbon footprint. So this leads to a newly minted term called green governance. It's about ensuring corporate actions to be in line with reducing environmental impacts. So now, basically, the managers will serve not only the profit maximization objective of the shareholders, but also the other preferences of the stakeholders. And the problem is that they're not always consistent with each other. So that leads to a problem about whether they can effectively implement climate-friendly actions and whether external governance is needed. So now let me come to the papers in this section. So these papers are very different in the sense that they're in three completely different areas, but they're all very interesting and kind of address a common set of research questions. How to motivate firms to internalize the impact of climate change and to take actions to reduce carbon footprint. And to translate it to English, essentially there are multiple sub-questions. Can firms regulate themselves? And how effective are these self-regulation or self-commitments? And can regulators play a role in disciplining or motivating these actions? So the main takeaway of these papers is also there's some consistent message among them. First of all, corporate commitments are somewhat effective. But at the same time, firms make these very grand gestures, but sometimes, on average, there is an effect, but there's also large variation across firms. Sometimes firms make these grand commitments, but they implement very little. Sometimes the commitments seem to serve a greenwashing purpose. And so as a result, regulators are still relevant. They're still important in motivating the firms to implement climate-friendly actions and in monitoring how firms fulfill their green commitments. Okay, so let's talk about these papers one by one. The first paper by Elvira talks about credible environmental disclosure. So what it essentially says is that after EPA enforcement, EPA violation, and there's a fine, and the firms are now making early announcements about their clean patents as a way to signal to the regulators that they're willing to behave, they're going to go green. So this is the first part of the paper. And the second part of the paper talks about the benefit of having green patents. So here we're comparing the scenario of green patents and not having green patents. And we find that having green patent is great. It generates multiple benefits, including reducing environmental emissions, increasing shareholder valuation, and also reduces the emission of peer firms, meaning firms that cite these green patents. So I find the paper to be very interesting and lots to learn from. And my main concern with the paper is the inconsistency between the two parts, because the first part seems to be about patent disclosure, and the second part is about having or not having a patent, which suggests it to be the effect of patent development. So the question is, which part is the paper documenting? Are the EPA violations or enforcement pushing firms to disclose early or to develop green technology, or are they simply pushing firms to make early, potentially premature announcements? So if it is the former, it is a very important finding, but I don't think that's what the author is trying to say. In fact, by showing that the patent disclosure comes in 1 year immediately after the violation, this timing is very tight. It suggests that this is a disclosure effect. So if it is the latter, it's about early announcement, then the second part, the benchmark group, seems to be off. We need to be comparing firms making early announcement versus firms making late announcement. And there, the benefit, once we shift this counterfactual, the benefit the implications could change a lot. It's very likely that we find that the EPA enforcement would make little difference because early versus late announcement may not differ that much. But that's an open question. I'll leave it to the authors. The second paper on net zero ledger essentially is the following. So the author notices that in recent years, there's explosive growth of corporations making commitment to net zero goals. And at the same time, we see the implementation varies widely across firms, and the effectiveness is questionable. So the authors suggest that regulatory oversight is necessary, and in particular, it proposes a very interesting idea. It's about net zero ledger, meaning that we should require the consistency between the climate commitment and the financial impact of these commitments. So I find this to be a very interesting and potentially thought-provoking idea. And obviously, there are multiple benefits of implementing this idea. First of all, this is a cost-effective way for government to intervene without being micromanaging. And it is also good for the firm to internalize their climate changing goals and to understand better the cost and benefits of these commitments. But at the same time, I have actually a lot of questions to the authors because I find it so interesting. So if we're making forward-looking commitment and we want to project that commitment into the financial statements, I wonder how you should exactly do it. So this is a typical, very simplified balance sheet and income statement, which I actually teach in my corporate finance class. So you can see that most of these accounts are very factual. They're backward-looking based on the sales made, based on the costs already incurred. And there are only a few accounts that are forward-looking, that incorporates forward-looking accounting assumptions. For example, accounts receivable. But these accounts actually depends on various other disciplining forces. For example, your accounts receivable would depend on the quality of downstream firms. Your depreciation would actually follows closely tax law and cannot be easily changed. At the same time, the valuation of certain assets could reflect your expectation of climate goals and transition cost. So let's think about, can we incorporate your climate goals with the valuation of intangible assets? I feel that there's still multiple challenges. First of all, how net zero commitment affects asset value likely vary a lot across firms based on the type of technology they have, the asset they have, and the industries they are in. So it's very difficult for regulators to impose a uniform standards. And on top of that, accounting assumptions are often subject to manipulation, as we learn from decades of accounting literature. So how to mitigate that type of incentive is also an important question to answer. In addition, I feel it might be difficult to judge, to distinguish for the regulators, whether to punish a firm for neglecting to incorporate these climate goals into their asset valuation versus making honest mistakes. I feel this is kind of a gray area of judging whether the accounting assumptions are fair and transparent. So I feel that when you take into account all of these challenges in making forward-looking statements, it might be better just to monitor ex post. For example, one potential solution is to just require firm to submit an expenditure plan when they make the make the commitment. And over time, you ask the firms to, let's say, separate your expenditures into climate-related and non-climate related. And this way, over time, you can see if the firm is on track to making its commitment or climate goals. And of course, this also comes with the challenge that firms could overclassify their expenditure into climate-related ones, but this seems to be a relatively smaller challenge compared to the ones related to forward-looking statements. Okay, let's then move on to the third paper about filling the governance gap. I thought this is a very unique setting and a set of really interesting results. So this study focuses on the gas flaring of African oil companies. And why do we choose African oil companies? Because this is a unique setting where the external governance is very weak and the shareholders are far away. So it is kind of the managers and the companies are left alone to make their decisions. So this is a good setting to study how effective these self-commitments are. So before we go into the weeds, I just want to take 30 seconds to explain what is gas flaring. Gas flaring is the burning of excess gas during the extraction process. It's kind of waste energy and pollutes the environment. It's bad for the firm and for the environment. So how do we reduce gas flaring? It requires the firms to invest in certain technology and requires infrastructure for to put the excess gas into productive use. Now, if you can resolve this problem, it benefits both the firm and also the environment. Okay, so now let's talk about the paper's main takeaways. So the paper finds that many oil companies have made the pledge to reduce gas flaring, and it seems to be effective. So we do see a decline in gas flaring after the commitments are made. So I find this result very nice, but at the same time, it's not less surprising because this is a very unique scenario where the shareholder, bringing back this governance plot, where the shareholder's goals and in terms of operational efficiency and the environmental goals are somewhat in line. They're not so much in conflict with each other. So I find this to be a nice confirmation of the theory. At the same time, I want to challenge the author a little bit that we do see a little bit overall declining trend even before the commitments are made. So it's possible that the companies just make the commitment when they're ready to upgrade their technology, when they're ready to replace their assets. So it's difficult to say this is the effect of making the commitment, but this could be basically reflecting a long-term trend of firms taking steps to change their technology. And finally, I find it very interesting. At the end of the paper, the author mentioned that there's some improvement brought about by divestitures. So oftentimes we think about committed firms being the green firms and uncommitted firms being the brown firms. And so once you transfer these facilities, we see the facilities are going to the worst places. But at the same time, is it possible that it's the opposite? That the committed firms are the brown ones, that they need to improve their technology, while the uncommitted firms are the green ones, that they already have the technology in place to reduce emission. And that's why we find the overall improvement associated with divestitures. Well, just a conjecture, and this is up to debate, of course. So overall, let me conclude. I find these papers to be really interesting. It reflects that the push towards reducing climate impacts is only effective when we have harmonized forces from the regulator, from the government, from the shareholder, and multiple other stakeholders. So this again leads to the discussion of what is good green governance. And the papers in this session have do a very good job in answering: can companies be left alone in dealing with climate change and achieving their climate goals? And ultimately, I think they advance our understanding about where the disciplinary forces come from and how do we improve green governance. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Janet, for your very insightful discussion. So if you have questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A function in the app, because we already see very interesting questions coming up. And last but not least, let's welcome Monica to give us the discussion from a practitioner perspective.
Thank you very much.
Come to you.
I think, can I take it from here? Oh, there? Okay, sure. I do not have slides with me, so I was going to take it from the seat, but I'm welcome to do it here as well. So hello everyone, Monica, Director of Investor Practice at Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. We are one of the network partners, work very closely with PRI as well in the region, and we work with investors directly who look into the Asian markets. So my comments will really be coming from the investor side, but also focus around some of the examples and practical elements from the Asian markets as well. What I will do is I will just I recognize that a lot of the people here are a mix of investor practitioners as well as from the academia as well. So I'll take a step back and kind of link the investors' commitments to some of the dialogue that has been papers that have been presented as well. I will not go through the papers one by one, but bring in the elements as I speak along. And probably it will start off with the net zero leisure and the companies, divestment, engagement angle to it, then go on to the patents and the externalities of research as well. So just to start off with, the investors, let's start off with the voluntary investors' commitments as well. Because a lot of investors, as you know, have made net zero commitments. AIGCC, as one of the network partners, we run the net zero asset managers for Asia, for the investors in Asia, with partners with the global level, as well as the Paris-aligned asset owners for asset owners. PRI has the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, as well as the corporate engagements that we do on a global level as a partnership as well, is the Climate Action 100+. There's also a Asia Utilities Engagement Program that sits outside of the Climate Action 100 Plus, what we run for the power utility sector in the Asian markets as well. So just to start off with, for investors, a lot of the discussions we have externally in the engagements with companies, as well as with policymakers, really starts off with the voluntary net zero commitments that investors have. And this will drive the conversations with the portfolio companies, as well as the dialogues with the policymakers in really seeing what these net zero commitments in the portfolio level, how that communicates and can also externally kind of influence in a way with the companies and policymakers as well. So in a sense, if I look across the board, those who have net zero commitments on the investment level for the investors is quite important. Because what they do is they start off with assessing the whole portfolio and seeing what's in scope, what's out of scope, what can be done and cannot be done. So it's an overall strategy approach that they would take. And with this, they would go into the action plans. And this is what is part of transition planning. And you may have heard a lot of that as well. And part of the transition planning incorporate into that is the angle of governance, which was touched upon quite a bit, the investment policies internally, as well as corporate engagement and policy engagement and the transparency and disclosure as well. So let's start off with the net zero ledger in a sense. I do think it was really interesting because there's a lot of like the voluntary investments as well. There is standardization in the commitments that are made, and also the credibility that it really brings in as well. So there's a survey by AIGCC, and what's been done in the survey is that if you look into the regulators and the net zero performances as well, one of the reasons why the net zero regulators, if you see a driver to the net zero investments, has been the regulatory requirements that have come out for the investors as well. So we have seen like about 60% of the investors really looking into this requirement have been the drive to really set and look into the net zero commitments. But also, more importantly, I want to highlight the importance of long-term performance and how that has incorporated into the decision-making of investors and why they are committing to net zero as well. So just as an example, GPIF, which is the Japan Government Pension Fund, way back in 2017, when they first really looked into the scenario analysis and the performance factor of the influence that net zero commitments can actually have, is that they found that over in the long term, that about 70% they were better off in terms of the portfolio performance. And that's one of the key drivers for investors, that long-term performance related and the importance of fiduciary duty that they hold, that has been the real driving force of these net zero commitments. And then that translates into the engagements with the policies as well as the corporates as well. Another factor that we have found very interesting is the definition. So you touched upon the not so clear definitions of net zero as well in your paper. And one of the elements that we have found is that there's about, in our survey last year as well, about a third had mentioned that the investors themselves are having it quite a challenge to actually have a clear definition of net zero, what that means. And also, so that was one of the areas that people are still working through in a way. And it was interesting to see that another, like in a way, a barrier to implementing or seeing what net zero is was the company side, which was touched upon as well by another paper, and the reporting from the companies and the clear reporting that has, one of the main barriers actually for the investors as well. The interesting element of the financial disclosures and incorporating that into the financial reporting has been really interesting, because there's Climate Action 100 plus, about 170 companies across the world. There's a company net zero benchmarking that is done. There's 11 criteria, one of them being the capex, the allocation of capital, in what the alignment is. And it is one of the lesser, I would say, area that we need to work on a lot, because only 1% of the Climate Action 100 plus companies actually have a clear plan and have been performing well along the benchmark. About 40% have partial, and more than half have not really accounted for that yet. So that's a clear signal that there's a lot of work to be done there. But also there are other elements where, and other organizations we have worked with to really educate the companies and the investors to actually how to incorporate a lot of the commitments into the financial reporting as well. So there are evolving work to be done, but just to mention that the elements you have reached out is quite interesting. And a lot of the work, some of it is regulator driven, but a lot of it is voluntary, and like the credibility of voluntary is increasing over time as well. Another point when it comes to financial disclosures or the increased inclusion of that, I just want to highlight the high emitting areas or high impact areas as per se, whether that's fossil fuel, deforestation, or even physical risk. There's quite a bit of work that can be done on the physical risk that can be incorporated into the financial operations and the effects of that as well. So that is something to be considered as well. The second paper I want to touch upon is the in relation, there's limited area where I can say around the African continent, but maybe I can bring some of the work done by the corporate engagements that we do on a global level, especially in Asia as well. So there are some, and I want to highlight maybe the core element of engagement versus divestment. There has been some transactions, I would say, of divestment happening, whether that's, as you mentioned, on the operation efficiency, or sometimes it's financial reasons that has driven that on the debt side of paying back the debt. But there have been cases where it's more on the emission side that what has been the driver. Interestingly, if you look into the case by case, there's also been cases where, financial industries scope 3, and the companies, when they're not considering scope 3 of the portfolio companies, if they divest financially but still hold it operationally, it means that it does not come into the financial financed emissions per se, because they're not considering scope 3. So you might have heard in previous discussions the importance of including scope 3 from investors' point of view as well, because then it really captures the broader scope of where the emissions are and where it lies within the supply chain as well. Just wanted to recognize that in a way, and because of timing, I mentioned the last paper in a sense of the patent, but I want to take it a little broader of the scale that we are trying to address here, because I think it's quite important to note that we all recognize the climate solutions in a way from investors. That's how we look into that area, is there's a lot of investments that need to happen. And if you even look into the electricity power, as Asia alone, you're talking about terawatts. So it's about over 14,000 terawatts versus the renewable capacity that is being built, or we currently have today, it's 1,500 gigawatts. So the balance of that and the scale of problem that we have is not just the financing and how many trillions of money that needs to flow into, but just the scale of it. It needs a lot of research, R&D into it. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the regulations in the US context. I want to raise something in the Japan context that has been happening, which is the green transformation bonds, but run by the government of Japan. It's sovereign bonds. There's a very different financially, very different financial product and approach that they have. But within that, they have issued sovereign bonds that are dedicated to research, R&D. So the first issuance earlier this year has really been looking into the R&D. Now, some of that has been, a lot of that focus, because the strong industrial manufacturing base that Japan has been going into some of the high emitting or hydrogen other sectors. But I want to raise another issue, that the clean energy sector really needs a lot more R&D. The cost has come down a lot, but there's still significantly more that can be done. A good example of that has also been in Japan a few months ago, where they announced a breakthrough in the technology of the solar panels that they have. So if you look into the solar panels, and the growth of that has been really been driven by the China market. And I think that's something to recognize as well, because China, if you look at the overall capacity growth, last year, 90% plus, over 90% has come from the China market. So if you look into like R&D and the supply chain angle, the geopolitics that were mentioned over the course of this conference as well, a lot of these technologies where the countries are thinking about growth in their own markets, and the technologies and supply chains to support that, there really is a lot more R&D that needs to happen. And you can see from the solar panel technologies that have come through into Japan, like the research institute under the Ministry of Energy, Trade and Industries have recognized, one of the research institutes have recognized that can actually drive a lot of the commitments on the renewable side just by that breakthrough as well. So the externalities of that is very important. And I would say, though, even though one of the elements that has been an ask from the investors has been on transparency, because the money has flown through into R&D, but it's very little understanding of where exactly the money has actually been used and what the research outcome has been. So because of that, we have been asking the government as a group to kind of explain and give more transparency, so they can understand the different technologies that are being used and can be transferred and related to the engagements that we do as well. And with that, I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica.
Thank you.
So now let's open up the floor for questions. And due to the time, probably we'll entertain about 1 to 2 questions. And I'll start with the question in the poll. However, if you want to ask your question in person, please feel free to raise up your hand. Okay, so we have the first question from Dana Phillips. The question is for Nathan. So the question is, do you think verification of sustainability metrics by auditors helps at all in bridging the gap, or does it just inspire less disclosure?
I want to say I pass, but I won't. No, I think it's a very good question. I don't know to which extent. I think it's useful, and that relates to a point I think that was also tackled by the discussants. What I say is not contradictory or should be construed as an alternative to the regulations that have come in. What I pointed out is that the loophole, the defaults in those regulations. And so assurance, of course, is important. I think it plays an important role. And assurance, but there is also here the role that auditors should play in assurance of sustainability disclosures. They should have in mind also the consistency with financial disclosures. And I'm afraid that this is not also part of the game because of these 2 different regimes. If you see in the European Union, it's very clear they created a whole different regime for auditors of sustainability disclosures compared to financial auditors, and that just risks widening the gap rather than reconciliating the 2.
Yeah.
I hope it's an answer.
Do we have anyone who wants to ask the question in person? Yeah. I have a microphone at the back, and also one at the front for Tom.
Hi, just a quick follow-up on that. My name is Johan Hill. I'm just wondering, with TCFD and ISSB and so forth, and forward-looking standards for disclosure on climate-related risks, because these are forward-looking estimates and they're based on assumptions and based on scenarios and based on models, is it realistic to to put much credence in those values? And then second, that's part A, and part B, if those figures were high, what does it tell us? And is it reasonable to expect companies to be very forthcoming with information about very high risks in the future based on hypothetical scenarios?
Can we take the last question from Tom first and then answer it together?
Yeah, sure. This might be a naive question. It's Tom Gosling, London Business School, on the flaring. So do we know for sure that when flaring goes down, it's because the methane is being captured as opposed to being vented, which would arguably be even worse than flaring?
Do you want to clarify?
Yeah, sorry. Do we know for sure that when flaring goes down, the methane is actually being captured as opposed to just vented?
I see. Okay.
Maybe
Go ahead.
Okay, so this has been brought up in academic audiences a few times. We think that explicitly the commitment says venting is off, not allowed at all. But we have been asked a few times, well, could they have just vented because it's not sort of observable? My answer to that would be, I believe, because the commitment says that, right? Companies would, go toward improvements and capturing rather than venting. And actually, we do also a test where we look at whether the improvements are larger where there are, liquefied natural gas terminals, and the improvements are larger around 100 kilometers around liquefied natural gas terminals. We actually took it out of the paper, but this was a prior analysis. So this gives us some confidence that at least when it's less costly to capture, that the improvements are more salient, suggesting that hopefully the majority of the improvements are coming from capturing and not venting. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe.
Well, the question on transition scenarios. It's hard to give an answer in 1 minute, given the time. But I do think it is useful and can be useful for building the kind of financial disclosures we want. To which extent these are reliable, like in everything that we talk today, accounting and non-financial disclosure. There is some discretion, and there are issues, and I think Monica, and Janet highlighted that in their comments. So I'm not saying it's gonna be ironclad, but it is useful to build better financial disclosures, but not on their own. Like on their own, what do they do? I'm not so sure. And for the longer answer, probably after the session.
Maybe quickly.
If I can just mention around your question, we had a discussion amongst the investors ourselves, just with a group of investors on how useful or currently how they're utilizing those scenario analysis, and what they're doing with it in terms of their investment decisions as well. I think if I can summarize, so there are very different approaches to that, but one of the summaries is that at this point of time, a lot of it is actually utilized for analyzing risk and where the pockets of risks are within the portfolio and going deeper after that as well. So yes, you can think of it, is it actually financially, is it priced in question? But also you can look at the other angle of where's the risk within your portfolio and going deeper into that and identifying that as well.
Yeah. So thank you very much for our audience for being here to join the discussion with us. And let's give a warm round of applause for our presenters and discussion here to give us this very exciting panel. Yeah. So thank you very much for attending this session. Now, if we can show yeah, thank you so much. So now we have 3 QR codes on the screen. The first one will tell you more about the information about the research program at PRI. The second is a survey about your academic interests. And last one is actually a new initiative that we're going to announce among MBS, Nanyang Business School, PRI, and ACGI on public lecture series. So a lot of scholars among the audience will give us the lecture, and I might reach out to other scholars to give us more insights into this area. So now let's go into the tea break, and after tea break, please come back to our last session, which will have the 2 award-winning papers on the research program. Yeah, thank you very much.